What's up, guys? Date Psych. Can you guys hear me? Whoever is in this chat, because this is the first time I've ever done one of these live streams. So I thought I would get you guys in here, see what kind of questions you have. But I have to make sure that I can even read the people in the chat and that sort of thing. Hi, Alex. I really respect you. Okay, good. I respect you too, and I hope you guys enjoy the channel and all of that. So let's see. In the meantime, while we're waiting perhaps for people to show up and do that, let me see if I can kind of add a moderation setting on here, something like that. Whoop. Just setting up here. Okay. So, question and answer session. If any of you guys in the chat have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask away. In the meantime, since everyone is just kind of rolling in here, I guess we can talk about the data from the newest survey that we have, which was on emotional connections and orgasms, the orgasm gap, and also the desire for an emotional connection during sex. We don't have the article up yet on the website for this, but I have run maybe half of the data from the questions we've asked. And it's up on Twitter. So this kind of emotional connection questions, what did we ask? We asked people, men and women both, various questions to the extent of, do you need an emotional connection to have sex with someone? And also, in relationships where you have had an emotional connection with someone, are you more or less likely to experience an orgasm? What sort of things did we find? Probably the most interesting result related to the orgasm gap is that women report orgasm frequency or experiencing an orgasm at all much more if they reported that they had an emotional connection with their sexual partner. Not the case for women who reported that they did not have an emotional connection with a sexual partner. Just looking at the chat features here. So if you've come in here recently, this is the first live space I've ever done. Any questions or anything like that, go ahead. I think we don't have many people in the chat right now, so maybe it's too few to do this kind of thing. But if we don't get some questions in here, I'll just shut it down because I'm just kind of trying to see the settings and set this up maybe for future chats. I'm not entirely sure what is a good time of day to do something like this, when people are available to watch it or whatever the case may be. But when I figure it out, maybe we'll get some more people in here. We can get a little bit more of a chat going on. But in the meantime, yeah, try to ask some questions for any of the past videos, any dating topics, anything along those lines that you guys are interested in. And let's see, whenever you guys might want to. In the meantime, I am just kind of flipping around and looking at some of these settings, so bear with me for this. Do you see anything else in the chat or anything? Just great. Okay, Red. You asked, what is your advice for late bloomers, 20 plus years old? So when it comes down, you know, I talk a lot about research and dating. lots of papers and that sort of a thing. And what does that tell us in general? You know, when we look at research, surveys, experiments, anything in dating science like that, we're looking at average effects, right? So you take a group of people and you say, what's going on with this group of people on average? And so the specific things we can glean from that can only apply to individuals to a limited extent, right? We learn about things, you know, in all essential experimental methodology, survey methodology, whatever the case may be, that applies to populations. Applying it to individuals is a little bit more difficult, right? Because if you think about it, individuals can fall anywhere within a distribution. They can be outliers, right? They can fall, you know, to the left of the tail, to the right of the tail, whatever the case may be. So the first thing then, you know, if we move from, you know, research orientation to a more clinical orientation, where we're looking at individuals, is to look at what is holding those individuals back. So you have late bloomers, right? 20 plus years old. They've never had a date. They've never had sex, anything like that. Then you have to ask why. And that's going to vary a lot from person to person. You know, one thing we know about individuals who remain involuntarily single for long periods of time, they tend to have much higher rates of autism, for example. So we know that autism is associated with impairments in interpersonal relationships. Difficult for them to form interpersonal relationships, to connect with others, particularly in a romantic context. And so what does that mean? They might not be able to read the emotional cues of other people. They might not be able to give the emotional responses, indications of interest that other people can read as well. So I'm using this as an example, this autism thing. And why is that? Because that could be one thing that holds a late bloomer back, but that's only going to apply to some people, right? That's not going to apply to everybody. So if you ask, you know, what's your advice for late bloomers? We have to take individual cases, right? We have to look at individuals and we have to say, okay, what are the specific things that are going to be holding a person back? You know, for someone, it could be autism. For someone else, it could be that they're just very shy, right? You know, we've done some research on risk aversion. They could just be very, very averse to risk. They could be afraid to simply ask women for dates, you know. Other individuals, you know, it could be something like physical attractiveness. You know, they could benefit from, you know, looks maxing, whatever the case may be. So on an individual level, you know, people got to look and think to themselves like, hey, what is going on with me specifically that is holding me back? And anyone that you're working with, clinical psychologist, you know, dating coach, whatever the case may be, has to kind of identify those weak spots, like what specifically is it? Because that's going to vary from person to person. But in general, what seems to be holding people back? So what is the advice for late bloomers? They probably need to put themselves into situations where they're interacting and speaking to women more, because that seems to be a big, big limitation in a general way, across the board, right? Generalizable is that men are not approaching women very much right now, right? That's kind of what our research in the past has shown. Men are not asking women for dates. And when I say approach, a lot of people think I'm talking about like cold approach, but it's not just cold approach. It's approach in any context at all. So, you know, young men are not asking women for dates at school. You know, their classmate, their cute classmate sitting next to them, she's probably smiling at him or whatever the case may be. He's not asking her for a date because he doesn't want to. He's afraid, whatever the case may be. That seems to be kind of the crucial thing that men who are late bloomers need to do. They need to put themselves in situations where they're, you know, decent amount of women around them. They need to interact with those women. Ultimately, you know, they need to cultivate positive interactions with those women. Ask them on dates. I think that's really what's holding people back. Aside from that, again, something generalizable to many, many people, physical fitness, the way someone looks. You know, we know that upper body musculature is really robustly associated with fertility outcomes for men, with attractiveness for men as well. So given that, you know, as far as the whole looks maxing thing goes, one thing most men could really, really do and start from a young age is work on physical fitness. Start bodybuilding, start lifting. Try, you know, to lose weight, don't be fat, but also try to put on a little bit of muscle. That's going to help. So those are two things I think that are effects that are robust enough that you could probably give them as general advice to most young men. Other things, you know, are going to be more specific to individual men in that case. Let's see what other questions we have here. So King Crocoduck, he says, does the literature say anything about gender differences in the amount of time taken to enter new relationships following a breakup? Any mediating variables of interest? So that's interesting. Something that men seem to do that women don't do is men seek out relationships following a breakup much faster. And given that, I'm not sure it's clear that men actually enter new relationships more quickly, But men definitely seek them out more quickly. Men almost, never seem to want to do like, oh, I need to take time and learn from the breakup and take some time and something like that. That seems almost exclusively a mindset that women kind of have. And it's not entirely clear that that actually helps people following a breakup, at least as far as what people report, their affect following a breakup. One of the things that actually helps people get over it a lot is just moving on to a new relationship. Now, that's just the way that they feel, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that that's like the good thing to do, right? Maybe if you're just moving immediately from one old relationship to a new one, you're not learning from it. You're not taking time. You're just probably selecting the exact same kind of people. But as far as like feeling better and getting over it, I think men have kind of learned just from experience, like, yeah, the fastest thing they can do is just move on. So I think men do that. Women are more likely to kind of take some time and that kind of a thing. Okay, good. So now we're kind of getting some questions here. So low pH. Yeah, so interesting. Thoughts on that racial orgasm gap study. So this is an interesting study. It was new. I just saw it a couple of days ago, and I haven't had time to go into it. But I'm gonna go into it. I'm gonna go over it more. I'll probably post about it in detail on Twitter in these upcoming few days here. Something that was really interesting. I think this is the first study that has explored that, a racial orgasm gap. And what did they find? White women, much less likely to orgasm. Latina women, much more likely to orgasm. It was something like 50% did not for white, or excuse me, yeah, like 50% versus 60%. To what extent is that genetic, right? To what extent is that due to differences in sexual behavior or even learning? There's different explanations for the orgasm gap out there. One of those is biological, right? That it's simply easier for men to orgasm. Another is kind of a biocultural explanation, right? That men learn to prioritize their own orgasm in a sexual encounter, but not that of women, or that women, don't necessarily demand in their sexual encounters the experience of an orgasm, or that women feel shame around their sexual behavior. So that's kind of an interesting question there. Is like, why do we see a racial orgasm gap? Is it because there is, some genetic difference, or are there attitudes towards sex that could vary by racial groups? But, I got to look at it more. I'm not sure. And I'm not sure the authors are going to be able to know that since it's mostly descriptive data. But, okay, so Red, I'm sorry if I'm missing some of your questions. Just go ahead and ask me. Let me see here. In the Pew Research data, certain races were more likely to be single than whites and Hispanics. Why do you think that might be? So we know from research on dating, there's basically a racial premium in dating. And I think this is one of the things that, incels have kind of figured out correctly, at least to some extent. And I think, something that happens in incel communities is they kind of exaggerate the magnitude and effect, but often they're, not entirely wrong that it exists. So we see a racial premium in dating. And this racial premium in dating, it looks kind of like white men and women tend to be preferred in dating in Western cultures. There's a strong within race preference that we see where people of their own races tend to prefer individuals in their own races, but then also there's a cross-race preference where you get a sort of hierarchy, right? And at the top of that tends to be white individuals, and at the bottom of that tends to be black individuals. You can see this in research on dating apps where there's like swipes and that kind of a thing. What happens at the end of the day? White men and women tend to get more matches than black men and women. And that effect is even more pronounced when it's cross-racial, right? So could that contribute to more black individuals being single? Perhaps. There is even an effect, in black communities in the United States, for example, that you see sex ratios that can be a little imbalanced. And why is that? Because of disproportionate number of black individuals in jail or in prison. So you can also find uniquely within black communities in the United States, women are much more educated than black men, black women, I should say. We're already seeing this effect across all races, where women are going to school more, they're graduating more. What do we know about female preferences very robustly across cultures and all of that? Women prefer to select up in status cues, right? Or at least across the hierarchy, hypergamy, right? So if you have, a subculture, a community or something like that, all of the women are educated, or a lot of women are educated. A lot of men are not. Women might feel like they have a hard time finding a mate who satisfies, essentially what they're looking for in a mate, which is kind of like someone on my level or better in that sense. Something we know from the research of David Buss, for example, is that educational level, it's this really, really robust status cue. And so what does that mean? We know that, status signals are, very robust signals of attraction for women. So having a level of education high is pretty important to women, and what is going to be high? It's going to be what's high relative to their own. So, if you have a bunch of women with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, you have many, many fewer men. Perhaps that's something that can contribute to it as well. Income also works a similar way. So if you have communities, that are lower income on average, that's another thing that can impact dating. So, there's a bunch of things there that could contribute to, why are more black men single than whites? Why? Well, a bunch of reasons, potential reasons there. So Kyle said, have you seen any research on demographics putting dating pressure on a particular gender or age group? I don't know if I understand that question entirely. Kyle, if you want to kind of rephrase that. I mean, one thing we know, is that basically the Zoomers much more likely to be single right now. When you look at what was the GSS data, it kind of turned into a meme chart from 2018. They're like, this percentage of 18 to 30-year-olds are virgins or single or whatever the case may be. You break that down by age group and you see something else. And you see, it's not just like everyone all the way through 30. It's really concentrated, between the 18 to 20, 24 age group. So right at that very, very beginning. So if there's a demographic that's really struggling with dating, right now, yeah, it's the young adult Zoomers, basically, or the late teen Zoomers, that kind of a thing. There's a lot of trends that are potentially related to that. One, as far as external forces that put pressure in that case would be economic. We see, Zoomers now leaving the house much later than previous generations. If you're living at home, at least for some people, that can kind of be a pressure. They're getting their driver's licenses much later. All of this is kind of related to what has been called extended adolescence and also to some extent to risk aversion as well. So we know that they're using alcohol less as well. They're going out to parties less and that sort of a thing. So yeah, I mean, these are all things that can kind of put pressures on this young demographic, 18 to 24 more or less, as far as not being able to date as easily perhaps as people within an age group, 20 years ago or something like that. Yeah, okay. Sephatrix said, I think what Kyle meant is there are fewer Zoomers than Boomers because of the falling birth rate. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head if that's the case, but it could be. And I mean, certainly in the future, because of falling birth rates, what has been called a demographic collapse, we're expecting to see, a much larger, older population than a younger population, and all of the consequences that come along with that. Hey, Daniel. Okay, so question. In what ways do you think you most disagree with Jordan Peterson in regards to dating and monogamy? Sometimes I sense that you are less restrictive than Jordan. Am I wrong? So, truth be told, I haven't read any of Jordan Peterson's books. I watch his, interviews and that sort of thing occasionally. I think, we probably have a pretty similar perspective on a lot of things, given, kind of what I've seen from him. And I think a lot of that is driven from a background in psychology. He's a clinical psychologist, practiced as a clinical psychologist, and a lot of his research was in personality psychology, which is my background as well. If you're approaching understanding human relationships, human behavior, psychology, that sort of thing from that perspective, yeah, I mean, usually when I see Jordan Peterson talk about psychology topics, it seems very conventional to me, which is kind of my own perspective on it. It seems like things that most psychologists, especially personality psychologists, tend to know. Do I disagree with him as far as dating and monogamy in the extent that I'm less restrictive than Jordan? Yeah, I mean, I always try not to be too, I guess, judgmental or restrictive as far as perspectives I have on what kind of relationships are best. I mean, I'm very much a pro-monogamy guy in that sense, at least for me, and I do think in general, we see across the research that having monogamous relationships, committed relationships, they make people happy. They tend to work out for well. And not only that, but we see that's what most people want. Most people are not interested in being single. Most people are not interested in having casual sex or in polyamory. But if people want to do that, I'm not out here telling them that, they're going to destroy Western civilization. But they are kind of a tail fringe of people. Like most people are just not that interested in that. And for me and my own research interests and that sort of a thing as well, it makes me a little bit less interested in that because it's like, it's not my experience as someone that's, you know, I'm not that interested in like polyamory or whatever. I'm interested in monogamous relationships because that's kind of my experience. Long-term monogamous relationships, I think they're good for people and they make people happy. And so, you know, as far as what kind of research interests do people tend to pursue, you know, sometimes they say research is like me search. So, you know, that's kind of what I'm interested in is like long-term monogamous relationships of like heterosexual people, but perhaps that's a little kind of passé in psychology. People now, they like to study like, you know, polyamorous, non-binary, no gender things that are very much on the fringe. And it's like, that's interesting. You know, there's not a lot of research on that, but it's also a very small percentage of the population. Jordan Peterson is probably more, you know, activist in that sense, and that, you know, he will go out and tell people like, this is the kind of relationship you need to have. You need to form a monogamous relationship to be happy and all of that. And I mean, you know, as I said, these are, you know, relationship patterns that do seem to be associated with happiness and life fulfillment, you know, getting married, having a long-term monogamous relationship, being in a stable relationship with one person that you love, and so on and so on. So, I mean, you know, I don't think me and Jordan Peterson would disagree probably on very much as far as that is concerned. I think probably I just tend to refrain a little bit more from going out and like telling people like, you should do this or you should do that. Let's see, the most recent question here. Do you think dual mating hypothesis for cheating applies to women who are very high in sociosexuality? Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that is kind of what a lot of people miss as far as the dual mating hypothesis goes and that kind of a thing, right? Is they seem to think that these two mating strategies apply equally to everyone just across the board. But that's kind of the whole point of the dual mate hypothesis, is that these are two sexual strategies that apply to individuals differently, right? And what is personality psychology? We call personality psychology individual differences because, you know, it's about differences in personality between individuals. Of course, we measure them as groups, but, you know, they manifest in individuals differently. So given that, you know, people high in sociosexuality are basically short-term mating strategists. That's essentially what we're looking at here. So yeah, you know, they are going to be more likely, if they're in a long-term relationship, to pursue on the side a short-term strategy, right? Now, as far as the real dual mating hypothesis, you know, the dual mate hypothesis of ovulatory shifts, the idea that, you know, women pursue a long-term relationship and then mate on the side to secure the genes, the better genes, right, of the alpha or whatever, someone with better genes. I don't think the research supports that well in general because we don't see the rates of extra-pair paternity that kind of support that. What is probably more the case? These are people just more likely to mate switch. They're people that are more likely to cheat. But it doesn't, and so, you know, the result, the effect of that can be kind of the same. What could be different, though, is, you know, the hypothesis that it's a pursuit of good genes. It's not necessarily the pursuit of good genes. And if you're someone, you know, that's pursuing a short-term mating strategy, what do we know about that? These people tend to prioritize physical attractiveness. So if they're going to cheat with someone, who are they going to cheat with? You know, especially if it's just like a hookup or something like that. Someone more attractive, right? That kind of a thing. So Luis said they're more attractive people who are high in I think he's asking, are people high in sociosexuality more attractive? So there's some evidence that men who are higher in sociosexuality are actually a little bit more attractive on average. Small effect. For women, that might not be the case. For women, that might not be the case. We see that women who are higher in a physical attractiveness are more sexually restricted. And women who are kind of, I guess you would say mid, right, tend to be more promiscuous on average. Why is that? Probably because women who are very high in attractiveness can kind of command the mate value that they want, in a sense. You know, they don't need to engage in frequent sex to secure a mate, whereas women who are perhaps a little bit lower in desirability might use sex as kind of a mate retention strategy. Wilson said, dope curtains, bro. Hey, so this house that I'm in right now, this is the Palmer house from Twin Peaks. If you guys ever watch that show, that is actually where I am right now. Let's see. Mo Kinchi said, weird questions. Will you make a looks maxing vid? I should, actually. And 2, will you do a grand collaboration with Mackin William and David Buss. I mean, I'd love to do something with the three of them, with Mac and William and David Buss. So right now, I'm in the U.S. I live in Europe. I'm in the U.S. now. Probably in a week or so, maybe I'll go meet with them to hang out. I don't know if we're going to do a video or anything like that, but probably going to go see everyone. Not all of them, but maybe William. I like William a lot. Let's see. Bisexual men are the most sociosexual, and they seem to be more... Yeah, maybe, Luis. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I think there was some research that found, bisexual men also have, there's a recent paper, higher fertility on average, which might be kind of surprising because, of course, we know, that gay men have lower fertility on average, right? Which you would expect, if someone is not pursuing a heterosexual relationship, they're less likely to have kids. But bisexual men, higher fertility on average. So kind of interesting. And, that could just be a sociosexuality thing there. Secret Mountain Troll said, have you read the book, Your Brain on Porn? I'm Gen Z, and looking back, it was that stuff that caused me to not have a girlfriend in high school. I think porn is much the primary cause for Gen Z's issue. Haven't read the book. I have looked into some of the research on the effects of pornography on the brain, but something as far as that is concerned is, I think the research is not very conclusive as to what extent pornography causes lasting effects on the brain. But that perhaps is not the best question to ask because, I have a background in neuroscience. Neuroscience is really bad at answering behavioral questions. It's really bad at asking questions about personality. If you want to know about people's behavior, you should just ask about behavior and just observe their behavior. So, does porn act in a way that can limit men's relationship formation? And I don't know, if we know the extent, because even that's kind of a hard thing to design. But, could it? If men are, using porn as a surrogate, many men report experiences like what you've just reported. They say, I spent a lot of time looking at porn. It kind of fulfilled my need. It acted kind of as a surrogate for emotional and sexual needs. And so I just didn't pursue women. A lot of men have this experience, So we know that at least for some men, the men that are sharing these experiences, that it seems to be true. We also know, that pornography can cause problems in relationships if it is not accepted in the relationship. And what does that mean? We know a lot of women do not approve of pornography use in relationships, over about half of women. They view it negatively to different extents. So if you're in a relationship with a woman, you're looking at a lot of porn, she doesn't like it, you got a problem in your relationship, and I think a lot of people kind of debate, like, is porn good? Is porn bad? To some extent, what is good and bad in a relationship is whatever, limits and boundaries you set in your own relationship. And then aside from that, we also see it's often the case that, men are seeking sexual novelty. If, men are seeking sexual outlet and novelty through porn and they're not having sex with their girlfriend, their wife, whatever the case may be, that can also lead to problems in the relationship. We know, once sex drops off in a relationship, once sexual satisfaction drops off in a relationship satisfaction drops off, yeah, you are in big trouble. So, Gary the Scout Trooper said, do you believe that anime consumption like porn is another reason why young men are not able to have a relationship? I don't know. It doesn't just have to be anime, does it? It can be anything that people engage in that acts as a surrogate that they're not pursuing a relationship for, right? So if someone is kind of wanting to get in, to a relationship, but they're occupying all of their time with something else, they're fulfilling their needs doing that, are they going to seek out that relationship? Perhaps they're not, and I don't know if that's something unique to anime or whatever. I mean, if there's a causal effect, maybe it's small and maybe it's just because like women don't like anime, but I don't know. There's no research on that. I'm just kind of guessing to that extent here. How can we explain assortative mating, says Luis? How is that possible, basically? Oh, well, let me say, El Hijo Perdido de Pala. He said, what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self? Don't be like a delinquent, probably. Stay in school, I didn't get things figured out until I was a little bit older. And given that, try not to get in trouble when you're young. You have the age crime curve, right? Where when people are young, between like 16 and 25, they get into a lot of trouble. Try not to do that. And that's what advice I would give to my younger self. Stay in school. Be good. What else? How do we explain assortative mating? So there's two explanations for assortative mating. One is essentially, propinquity, that assortative mating puts people who are similar into proximity. For example, if you're kind of intelligent and you're kind of conscientious, you might go to school, and given that, you might go to the university, you might be around other people who go to the university, who have traits, behaviors, socioeconomic status who are similar to yours. So just being in proximity to those people, you might see that you meet someone you like, you get into a relationship with them. So in that sense, assortative mating is only an effect of being in proximity with people. The other is more of a proactive assortative mating, that people select others who are similar to them deliberately. So you are, a goth, you like gothic culture or whatever, or the look. You're going to a gothic club, you're getting yourself a big titty goth girlfriend. That is what you want. Well, that's very deliberate, right? You've selected assortatively for someone who is similar to you because that is what you want, right? You have, hobbies or something like that. You like someone who is intelligent that you can connect with because you're an intelligent person. So those are two ways that assortative mating happens. People select assortatively for traits in others that they like. And we know this is the case from personality psychology. People are attracted to others who are similar to their own personality. And, they show preferences for that, and they actually select mates based on that. So you have that, and then at the same time, you have the propinquity effect, right? Just being kind of in the proximity of those people. Titan said, young men have to deal with their potential mates having access to the internet and having the perceived access to a large pool of mates. It's the internet that changed it. Maybe, but something to consider. A lot of the dating difficulties and all of that, people attribute this to the rise in online dating. There was a really large study that looked at the number of sexual partners individuals had, college students, in fraternities and outside of fraternities, between something like 2012, 2018. So basically the time that dating apps got really popular, like Tinder, and then on to that. Given that, did we see, that it kind of shifted the number of sexual partners that individuals had? That's kind of what we would expect, right? If dating apps had a big effect in that sense, we would see, what's been called the 80-20 rule, right? Given that, the 80-20 rule, the idea that, a small percentage of men are monopolizing all of the women or something similar to that. But that's not what the results showed. Basically, the distribution of sexual partners, as far as that goes, stayed stable between 2012 and 2018. This is also kind of what we see in GSS data as well. So we don't actually see a big shift. There's a really good account on Twitter. His name is Nuance Enjoyer. Some of you guys that are here from Twitter will recognize him. He does really good analyses of the data as well. He found the same thing, looking at like the top 10% of men, top 5%, top 20%. Did they start collecting more sexual partners as time went on? No. And we also know, that most women are simply not on dating apps. They're not at any given moment. Many women have never used them. Women might only be using them sporadically, on and off. We see a big, imbalanced sex ratio on these dating apps. So it's probably not the case, that most women in your potential pool are on a dating app and thus have access to essentially this huge pool of men, right? It's not most women, because we know most women are not on dating apps. So given that, is there an effect there? Could something be going on? Potentially, but it's small. And it's not really enough to kind of explain why, is dating more difficult? Why does it feel harder for young individuals, because this is, again, a problem we see concentrated in the Zoomers. Why does it seem so hard for young Zoomers to date? Something that has occurred to me is, when you're young, when you're 18 to 20 or something like that, it's very normal to feel like it's hard to date. It's very, very normal to feel just like I can't get a girlfriend or whatever. I mean, that is not an entirely new dating experience. That's something men in the 90s experienced as well. You can see this in popular culture from those eras. You can go back to, the 1960s. There was a show from the 1960s, the longest running sitcom in American history. It's called The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis or something like that. The entire plot of this sitcom was a 17-year-old boy who simply could not get a girlfriend. You know, he's just the whole time like, I can't get a girlfriend, I can't get a girlfriend. This is just, has been a universal experience for men, especially young men in that age range, that like, hey, it's hard. But where are the men that might be pulling the attention of those women away? We know women prefer men who are a little older on average, and that women date up on average. So if you are a man who is 18 years old, a lot of the women in your immediate dating pool, they could simply just be dating men who are a little bit older. And that's probably why we see, this kind of difference in singleness. If you look at like the Pew data set, the Pew data, that kind of thing that kind of goes around so much, what do we see? A large percentage of men, about 60%, say, I'm single within, this tiny range of ages. About 30% of women. What's happening? They're simply dating up in age. That can account for almost all of that gap. So given that, that's something to consider, that if you are, 17, 18, 19 years old, the women who you're interested in, because you're probably not going to be wanting to date like young teenagers, might simply not be that interested in you. You might not have that much to offer. They might be interested in men who are, 22, 24 or something like that. But as you get a little bit older, you'll probably find that just kind of works itself out. Luis said, dating seems to be more difficult today because most men are unable to overcome a fear of rejection. That's the reason why dating apps became popular. So that's a good observation. So we know that this fear of rejection does impact negatively dating outcomes, right? We've run 2 surveys on that. Men who report more difficulty in dating have a higher fear of rejection. And it's related again to risk aversion, right? The men who are not approaching women at all, higher fear as well of these kinds of consequences. So given that, we know that that's part of it. Now it's interesting. That's why dating apps became popular. So a few people have talked about this, not in, psychology or research communities, but kind of in dating app communities. And that's the idea that social media, dating apps in particular, act as a buffer. And what does that mean? You can go on a dating app and you can swipe and, you'll be rejected when women swipe left, but you won't feel it. It's not like going out and asking a woman like, hey, would you have a date with me? And then she just says no to your face. So dating apps, online environments act kinds of a buffer to rejection. So individuals who, are very afraid of rejection, they might simply go out there, make a dating app profile and be like, this is it. I could not imagine speaking to a woman in a bar, talking to her or anything. Perhaps for young individuals, that's their first attempt at even dating. It's not that, they ask the high school cheerleader for a date or, that they're going to the bar after college with their friends or asking their classmate in college or whatever. It's a dating app. They're just making a dating app and they're putting their pictures up and they're saying, wow, I'm not getting any matches. It's over. So something to consider. Thoughts on authenticity. How important is it to be authentic versus competing in the dating market? Sometimes those two are in conflict. So, authenticity, difficult to measure in the research, but there has been a few papers on authenticity. And we know that this is something that when it is perceived by women and men, it's seen as attractive. Okay, to not be authentic at the same time is arguably a form of deception. And it's not going to be something you can keep up for a long time. Imagine, if the only way you can get a date or be attractive to women or something like that is to put up a facade, right? To put up an image or something like that, that this is the kind of person I am. How long do you think you're going to be able to keep that up? How long are you going to be able to keep up an image of someone who is not you to secure a mate, to go on dates and that sort of a thing? It's probably remarkably difficult, especially, if it comes to personality and all of that, just kind of living an act. Most people can't even do it, to begin with in a convincing way. So yeah, authenticity, it's not even just, is authenticity important? Authenticity is almost not even a choice. Most people are probably not able to even convey a non-authentic self. So Titan said, let's see, the AI is going to give you Alex. Well, I don't know. That comment is incoherent there. Let's see. If you lose money, you lose nothing. If you lose something. If you lose character, you lose everything else. Yeah, I mean, that's a good maxim there. Money can be retained, you know, health, maybe you can regain it, whatever the case may be. If you lose yourself, you know, you're someone new now, I guess. But back to the authenticity question. If you feel like the kind of person you are is not successful dating or whatever the case may be, you know, if you feel like the kind of person that you are is not helping you get the outcomes and the results that you want in life, maybe what you need to do is work on changing the kind of person that you are. You know, to some extent, you have to wonder, do you even like yourself at that point? Do you need to improve yourself? Do you need to become a different kind of person? So given that, you know, it's not a question of being inauthentic or not. It's a question of changing yourself into an authentic kind of person, the kind of person that you want to be. Luis said, for women, it's more difficult to relate with men in a virtual environment than real life. They have these irrational fears of the guy behind the screen. Yeah, women are constantly on defense, right? And that's, you know, part of the ancestral disposition of women, right? That's something we know, you know, from evolutionary psychology, is that men always represent a sort of threat to women in that case, that men always represent a potential threat, and also that many of the traits that women like also simultaneously represent a potential threat. So think about something like height, physical size, right? A man who is physically imposing can protect a woman, but at the same time, a man who is physically imposing can also be more of a physical threat to a woman. So women always kind of have this fear of men that men don't have of women. And, you know, dating apps, they kind of create that environment, like, who am I talking to? If I meet someone off of this app, are they going to be a serial killer? You know, personally, I don't think they're more dangerous. I don't think there's any evidence to believe that dating apps are actually pose more of a threat or are more dangerous to women than just meeting a stranger in a bar. Probably, you know, if you were a serial killer, meeting someone in a bar would leave less of a paper trail than meeting someone on an app. But, you know, there is kind of that perception. But I think, you know, what apps do more than that is they don't convey the kind of information that women need to feel attraction to a man, which is often seen in movements, interactions, behavior, and all of that. If women are just looking at a picture of a man, that's often not enough for them to think this is someone who's attractive. And that's why we see, you know, women rate male photos very, very low. We see this in like the OkCupid data. You know, we also see this in just across the research whenever we look at male and female ratings of male faces. Women just rate a lot of male faces really, really low. So, you know, that's something to consider if you're going on a dating app and you feel like you're not getting matches or anything like that. You might do better in interactions. You know, interactions let women perceive you a little bit differently. We know that behavior impacts perceptions of physical attractiveness and the other way around. So another question here, let's see. Is there any data on the effects of a high body count? Other than social stigma, is there any reason these women would be lesser mates? The red pill seems to have a phobia of promiscuous pasts. So one thing we know, you know, is that some of these things are true. What do we know about a high body count? And this is true for both men and women. This is not just for women. This is true for men and women. Individuals with a high body count, more likely to get divorced, more likely to cheat, right? They're more likely to, you know, be high in the dark triad. There's a lot of negative things that are associated on average with a high body count. Now, this doesn't mean that any individual with a high body count is going to necessarily have any of these things going on, because on an individual level, they can fall anywhere. These are average trends. You know, if you compare you know, a group with a high body count versus a low body count. That's something to consider. But, you know, I think you're onto something when you say the red pill seems to have this phobia of body counts. And, you know, I've run a few surveys on body count. Consistently across these, what do we see? It's that men who tend to have kind of fewer sexual experiences, who tend to view themselves as having lower mate value, they tend to worry a little bit more about body count. They seem to care more. And so again, we see an effect of assortative mating here. What is that? Men who are very promiscuous, who have had a lot of sex, they care less about women who have had a lot of sex. At the same time, you know, men who have had very little sexual experience, they tend to prefer a woman who as well has had very little sexual experience. Perceptions for men and women actually very similar. You know, I think something a lot of the manosphere discourse gets wrong is this idea that male body count is going to be some kind of signal toward women that's positive. Not the case. Men and women both have an ideal body count. You know, if you ask them, like, what's your ideal in a partner, that's pretty low. It's usually not actually 0, so it's not actually a preference for virgin is the most common, but it's usually going to be like 2 or 3 people. So some very limited sexual experience in that case. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I would consider something like a very high body count, perhaps a yellow flag. You know, you want to ask, okay, why did this happen? What is your relationship experience? You know, imagine you're on a date with someone, you find out they have a high body count, or you've gotten to know someone and you like them, and then you find out they have a high body count. You might want to ask, you know, how did that happen? You know, what has your relationship trajectory been? Did you have a bunch of hookups? Are you unable to keep a relationship together? Because that's one way that individuals can have, you know, a high body count. Imagine if someone has a high body count, not because they want to be super promiscuous or, you know, because they have a really high orientation toward casual sex or they're having orgies or whatever, but because they can't hold a relationship together. They can't make it more than 2 or 3 months in a relationship. So they have sex with people, it's over. They have sex with someone, it's over. I mean, that would be kind of a red flag, wouldn't it, for anyone interested in kind of a long-term committed relationship. So these are things that you would, you know, want to assess, I think, situationally in your actual interactions with men or women. You know, you try to apply it like as a broad rule. And I think that's, you know, what a lot of manosphere and dating discourse gets wrong, is they try to turn these things into rules instead of indicators. Like, okay, this can inform my behavior when I'm actually dating someone. How do I assess them? How can I think about them? As opposed to just being like, oh, nope, I don't like it. Luis said, gay men don't seem to have those fears that women have in online environments. And we know that gay serial killers, yeah, men, well, that's something about men, isn't it? That men don't have those fears because men probably didn't evolve to have that kind of fear where they're consistently afraid of the same sex or the opposite sex. Men in general are much more inclined to take risks. You know, men are much more likely to die from homicide. Men are much more likely to die from accidents. All of these things. Let's see. Any thoughts on being able to live a life without falling in the addiction of watching reels on every social media, resisting the algorithm? I don't know. I wish I could help you with that. How do you live a life without getting addicted to social media? I guess delete it. You know, just stop doing it. That's all you can do. He said, thanks, that answer aligns with my own observations. In other words, pay attention to trends, but realize they're not rules. Still looking forward to having you on the show. Yeah, looking forward to it, definitely. And that's exactly it. Pay attention to trends, because that is what all of the research is about. You know, and I think people look at research and they say, you know, group A is higher in something than group B. They think it applies to everyone in the group. But we're looking at population averages, which express trends. Individuals within 2 groups that differ from one another, they can fall anywhere. You know, women with high body count have low self-esteem. And this is coming from a woman who regrets her past choices. Yeah, I mean, that does actually seem to be the case, you know, at least on average, that having a higher body count can be associated with poorer mental health, both in men and women. So why is that? Well, you know, one way that people can feel better about themselves is through sex. They can feel loved that way. They can seek validation that way, that kind of a thing. So if someone is going out and, you know, they're saying, this is someone that will have sex with me, they'll spend the night with me, they might feel loved, they might feel validated, you know. And if there's someone that, you know, really needs that because they have low self-esteem or something else going on, they might accumulate more sexual partners over the time like that. Anyway, I think I'll do, you know, one more question and then I'm out, because this was just a little experiment trying to do this and it's getting kind of late here. But gym advice. Okay, great. Good question. Gym advice. I'm an ectomorph that really struggles to gain weight. So, you know who really helped me with bodybuilding is Dr. Mike Israetel. I would look at his programs. You know, look him up on YouTube and look into his programs. That would be a good place to start as far as like research-based. You know, I do a PPL, push-pull legs, 6 days a week. You have to count your calories if you're not used to it. You have to count your macros and make sure that you're getting enough protein, you know, gram of protein, pound of body weight. But, you know, the more you look into it, you can get more detailed. But I think that's what a lot of people struggle with when they first start bodybuilding is, okay, progressive overload, getting on a program that's designed for them well, you know, where you're increasing your reps and your weight and all of that. You know, you're going to want to find a fitness influencer like Dr. Mike, yeah, who's going to be more detailed in getting you on that program. But it's the food thing. It's the food thing. If people are not growing and they're not gaining the weight that they need, it's the food. They're just not eating enough. They're not eating enough protein. They're not eating enough calories. People really are bad at estimating how many calories they're eating. And this is why so many people become obese. This is also why people who struggle to make gains when they're lifting struggle, because they're, probably overestimating the calories that they are eating, right? They're struggling. And that. Food you love. I eat a bunch of cottage cheese. Look, if you want to get the protein that you need and all of that, forget about food you love. Maybe you won't, but easy to eat is cottage cheese. Easy to eat is cottage cheese. I have people sitting on the couch laughing at me because that's all I do is just eat cottage cheese all day long. But it works. That's it. You want something that's easy to eat. And that's the real question. Don't think about like what foods are good that I can eat a lot of protein. Just think about like what can I stuff down my throat that has like a sufficient amount of protein that I can do it with, And at the end of the day, you have to learn to eat. You have to learn to eat because, when I started trying to bulk and eating enough, I hated eating that much food. I'm the kind of person where I've never been fat and I will just eat until, I'm satiated, and that's it. That's when my body signals you don't need to eat anymore. And so often eating more means eating, an amount that you think is like too much. I feel full, but yeah, that's why you got to count your calories and your macros and be like, okay, have I eaten enough? Has the calculator said I've eaten enough? That's what you got. Isaac here said, I put on 30 pounds with eating every 2 hours, push-pull legs, high volume calisthenics. Exactly. Yeah, that sounds good. That's exactly what I would do there. Anyway, that's it for today. I'm going to do this again soon, guys. I'm going to do another one of these because this is fun answering the questions. I'll try to have a better setup. I was just kind of chilling and wanted to play with it today. Anyway, thank you all for tuning in. I'll talk to you guys again very soon.